The morning sun shimmered over the lake, painting golden ripples across the still water. Coleman stood on the wooden deck of his small cabin, a half-fixed fishing rod balanced across his knees. He had been coming here for years, a week each spring to fish, rest, and let the noise of the city fade into the quiet whisper of trees and water. The world around him was calm, almost too calm. A faint rustle broke that silence. At first, he thought it was just the wind shifting through the reeds near the shore. But then came another sound, a soft, almost pleading yelp. Coleman looked up from the tackle box, eyes narrowing toward the tree-line. The movement was subtle, two small shapes slipping from shadow into sunlight. He froze. Two lynx cubs stood there, maybe 5 or 6 months old. Their paws were muddy, their fur matted around the necks. They looked thin, nervous, but not wild with fear. In fact, they didn't run. They just stood there, staring at him, and something about their eyes made his heart race. Coleman slowly set down the rod and rose to his feet. The boards beneath his boots creaked. The cubs flinched, but didn't flee. He had seen lynxes before, fleetingly, from afar, but never like this. Two kits standing out in broad daylight, so close you could count their whiskers. He took a cautious step forward. "Hey there, little ones," he said under his breath. His voice sounded strange in the still air. The cubs tilted their heads. One gave a small cry, short, high-pitched, almost like a call for attention. The other glanced toward the woods, then back at him. Coleman hesitated. Maybe they were hungry. That made sense. Maybe their mother had been hurt or gone too long. He turned toward the cabin, went inside, and came back a minute later with a plate of fish, fresh perch from the night before. He placed the fish on the edge of the porch, then stepped back several feet. The cubs looked at the food but didn't move closer. They sniffed the air, restless, pacing a few steps back and forth. Then one of them took a cautious step away from the porch, not toward the fish, but toward the woods. It stopped, turned, and looked right at him again. Coleman frowned. The second cub followed the first, pausing a few yards away, glancing back at him as if waiting. They weren't begging for food. They were asking for something else. He crossed his arms. "What are you two doing?" he murmured. He waited, but they only kept watching. The wind shifted, carrying a faint, strange sound from somewhere deep in the forest, a muffled cry, maybe an animal, or maybe the wind itself. The cubs reacted instantly. Their ears perked up, both turning in the same direction, then looking back at him again. His pulse quickened. "Your mom, huh?" he said quietly. The idea hit him hard and clear. It wasn't just hunger that brought them here. Something had happened. He looked toward the tree-line, then back at the cabin. The practical voice in his head told him to stay put, to call the rangers, maybe. But he was hours away from the nearest outpost, and whatever was happening now. He exhaled, rubbing a hand across his face. "All right," he muttered, stepping back inside. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right." He grabbed his pack from the hook by the door and started filling it. A flashlight, first aid kit, rope, his tranq rifle with 2 loaded darts. He didn't like using it, but it had saved his life once when a panicked deer nearly trampled him. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, zipped up his jacket, and took one last look around the cabin. The silence felt heavier now. When he stepped back outside, the cubs were still there, waiting. One pawed at the ground. The other sat down, tail twitching impatiently. Coleman took a breath and nodded. "Lead the way." The first cub turned and trotted toward the trees, glancing back after every few steps. The second followed close behind. Coleman adjusted the strap on his shoulder and walked after them, boots crunching through damp pine needles. The forest swallowed them quickly, sunlight thinning into a maze of shadows and green. Every few yards, one of the cubs would stop, check that he was still coming, then dart ahead again. The deeper they went, the more uneasy he felt. Birds had gone silent. The air grew cooler. He could feel the faint weight of worry pressing against his chest. They reached a narrow trail that wound through the pines and dipped slightly downhill. Coleman slowed his pace, scanning the ground. Tracks were everywhere, the cubs' small prints, overlapping with larger ones. Fresh ones. He crouched and touched the dirt, still soft. "She's close," he whispered. The cubs gave a short, urgent cry and sprinted ahead. Coleman straightened, following faster now, adrenaline rising. Something deep in the forest waited, and he was already too far in to turn back. The forest grew denser as Coleman followed the cubs deeper into the trees. The bright morning light faded into filtered streaks through the canopy, the air cooler and heavy with the scent of damp moss and pine. The cubs moved ahead with a strange purpose, darting forward, pausing to glance back, then continuing on. They never made a sound beyond an occasional soft cry, a reminder that he wasn't just wandering aimlessly. Coleman kept his eyes low, watching for roots and holes. The trail began to slope downward, and soon the soft ground gave way to uneven rocks. He steadied himself with one hand against a tree trunk, his other gripping the strap of his rifle. Every step deeper seemed to draw out the quiet. The hum of insects faded. Even the wind stopped whispering through the leaves. He heard it before he saw it, a sound so faint he thought it was his imagination. A low growl, distant and muffled, but sharp enough to freeze him in place. The cubs reacted instantly, their ears twitching. They hurried forward, breaking into a run. Coleman followed, his boots slipping slightly on the damp ground. The trees opened suddenly into a small clearing. At its center was a jagged opening in the earth, almost invisible until you were right on top of it. The cubs stopped at the edge, pacing anxiously, letting out tiny, frightened cries. Coleman slowed, scanning the ground, realizing the danger. The pit was deep, a natural sinkhole or maybe a collapsed burrow, dark enough that he couldn't see the bottom. Then came the sound again, clearer this time. A deep, throaty growl followed by a weak, pained hiss. Coleman's stomach tightened. He leaned forward, careful not to get too close, and peered into the shadows. Two amber eyes blinked up at him. It was the mother. She was trapped near the bottom, her body wedged awkwardly against the side of the pit. Her fur was dirty, one paw twisted at an unnatural angle. She must have slipped in chasing prey or protecting her cubs. The sight hit him hard. He could tell she was exhausted, fighting to move, but unable to climb out. The cubs whimpered at the edge, pacing restlessly. Coleman backed up a few steps, scanning the area for something he could use. The sides were steep and crumbling, the soil soft and unstable. Even with his boots braced, one wrong step and he could join her down there. He exhaled slowly. "All right, girl," he said under his breath. "We're gonna get you out, but not like this." He knelt, unshouldered his rifle, and loaded a single tranquilizer dart. The idea wasn't to knock her out completely. Just calm her, make sure she didn't panic and hurt herself more. He aimed low, toward the darker side of the pit, watching her breathing pattern carefully. "Easy," he whispered. He squeezed the trigger. The dart hissed through the air, hitting the soft earth beside her before bouncing into her shoulder. Maya jerked, snarling weakly, her claws scraping the dirt walls. The cubs cried out, but Coleman stayed still. Within moments, her movement slowed. The rise and fall of her chest became steady, calm. He waited another minute to be sure. When it was quiet again, he crouched near the edge, calling softly to the cubs. "Hey, it's all right. She's just resting now." One of them crept close, sniffing the air, mewing softly. Coleman reached out a hand, but didn't touch. They trusted him enough to come close, and he didn't want to break that fragile thread. He looked down once more, the mother's flank still moving rhythmically, her body safe for the moment, then stood and glanced toward the sky. The light was shifting. Afternoon already. He needed a rope, harness, something strong enough to pull her up. He glanced around the clearing, nothing but roots and stone. "Damn it," he muttered. Too steep to risk it empty-handed. He backed away from the pit, motioning for the cubs to follow. They didn't want to leave, whining softly at the edge, but when he started walking, they trailed behind reluctantly, glancing back again and again. Coleman moved quickly. The way back seemed longer, heavier. His mind raced with details. Length of the rope in the shed, where he left the gloves, if the light would hold long enough. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, the cubs ran ahead, slipping under the deck. Coleman jogged the last few yards, breath clouding in the cooler air. He threw open the shed door, grabbing the coiled rope from the wall and tossing it into a duffel. He added a pair of gloves, carabiners, and a lantern. It would be dark soon enough. The cubs were circling the porch when he came out. He crouched, meeting their eyes. "I can't have you running into the woods without me," he said gently. They blinked, not understanding, but his tone was calm enough to keep them from bolting. He opened the shed again, spread a bit of hay in one corner, and placed a shallow bowl of water beside it. Then he motioned to the cubs. "Just for a little while," he whispered. To his surprise, they followed him in. He closed the door behind them, securing it with a simple latch. He hated the sound of the lock clicking shut, but knew it was safer that way, for them and for him. He slung the duffel over his shoulder, checked his rifle, and looked once more toward the forest. The light was fading fast. "Hang in there, girl," he murmured, starting back down the path. "I'm coming back for you." The forest was turning gold and gray when Coleman reached the clearing again. The sun hung low behind the trees, sending long shadows across the ground. He dropped the duffel near the edge of the pit, catching his breath. His pulse thudded in his ears, both from the hike and the knowledge of what he was about to do. The pit looked deeper than before, darker too. He could barely see Maya at the bottom. She was still breathing, slowly, steadily, but the tranquilizer would not hold for long. The cub's faint cries echoed in his head, though the forest around him was silent now. He kneeled and uncoiled the rope, his fingers stiff from the cooling air. "Easy now," he murmured, as if the lynx could hear him. "We're getting you out of here." He looped the rope around the thick trunk of a pine near the edge, tying 2 safety knots the way his father had taught him years ago. Then he attached a carabiner, testing it with a tug. The bark creaked, but the tree held firm. He slung the lantern over one shoulder and strapped the rifle to his back before edging closer to the rim. One last glance into the pit. Maya shifted weakly, her tail twitching. He couldn't wait much longer. Coleman wrapped the rope around his forearm and started to descend, boots scraping against the cold dirt wall. The earth was loose, small stones breaking free under his weight. He moved slowly, setting each foothold carefully, breathing through his teeth. The scent of damp soil and fur grew stronger the lower he went. Halfway down, the wall gave a soft crack beneath his left boot. He froze. A chunk of dirt fell past him, landing with a dull thud beside Maya. She stirred, letting out a faint growl. Coleman steadied himself, adjusting the rope, forcing his heartbeat to slow. Inch by inch, he continued until his boots touched the bottom. The air was heavy, wet, and cool. He could hear Maya's breathing clearly now, short, uneven. Her paw was twisted beneath her, fur darkened with blood near the joint. Coleman crouched, careful to stay out of her reach. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, but the muscles in her shoulders tensed when he moved. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "It's all right. You're okay." He reached into his pack, pulling out a short length of rope he'd tied into a makeshift sling. Working quickly, he looped it under her torso and around her hindquarters, careful not to touch the injured leg. Each time the rope brushed her fur, she twitched, a soft growl rumbling in her chest. He murmured quietly, more to steady himself than to calm her. The rope rubbed raw against his hands, even through the gloves. He tied the last knot and tested the tension, secure enough to lift. But Maya stirred again, her breathing quickening. The tranquilizer was wearing off. "Damn it," he muttered. He needed to move fast. He grabbed the main line he had anchored above and clipped it through the harness he'd made. Then, bracing one foot against the wall, he pulled. The rope tightened, the weight heavy and unyielding. He grunted, muscles straining. The lynx didn't help. Her body sagged, limp and dense with muscle. For a moment, he thought it wouldn't work. His boots slid an inch through the mud. He adjusted his footing, pulling again, inch by inch. The rough sound of the rope against bark echoed above. When he finally got her a few feet off the ground, he tied off the slack, rested, then climbed up a bit to adjust the angle. He repeated the motion again and again, lifting her slowly toward the mouth of the pit. Each pull was harder than the last, his shoulders burning, breath coming in short bursts. The lantern swayed from its hook, sending shaky circles of light across the dirt walls. Halfway up, the line snagged on a root. Coleman cursed under his breath, pressing his back against the wall for balance. He pulled to one side, then the other. The root cracked and gave way, sending a small shower of soil down his neck. He didn't stop. Almost there, he panted, his voice rough. Just a little more. When Maya's body finally reached the rim, he climbed the last few feet, grabbing the rope with both hands. Using what strength he had left, he hauled her onto the grass, collapsing beside her. The rope burned lines across his palms, his chest heaving. For a moment, there was only silence, the sound of wind stirring through the pines again, the first breath of evening. Coleman rolled onto his side, watching Maya's flank rise and fall. She was alive, but blood still seeped from her paw. He pulled off his jacket and folded it under the limb to slow the bleeding. "You're safe now," he said softly, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. The last light of day stretched across the clearing, painting the trees in amber. Coleman sat back on his heels, staring at the pit he had just climbed from, a black wound in the earth. He knew it could swallow anything unlucky enough to cross it. He wasn't about to leave it open, but that would have to wait. He wiped his hands on his jeans, took one more look at Maya, then started gathering the rope. The night air was coming fast, cold and sharp. He needed to get her somewhere warm before the chill set in. Coleman stood, bracing himself against the ache in his arms, and whispered to the fading forest, "Let's get you home, girl." By the time Coleman carried Maya back to the cabin, the sky had turned a deep blue-gray. The air was cold enough that his breath came out in clouds. He staggered under the lynx's weight, her body limp but heavy against his arms. Every few steps, he had to stop to catch his breath. The duffel bag with his rope and lantern thumped against his hip, and his boots left dark prints on the frosted grass. The shed stood just a few yards from the cabin, its wooden frame glowing faintly under the porch light. He nudged the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The smell of old hay and oil filled the air. It wasn't much of a shelter, but it was dry and away from the wind. He laid Maya down gently on a pile of hay, her fur brushing against the rough strands. She stirred slightly, a weak sound escaping her throat, and her paw twitched. Coleman crouched beside her, checking the wound again. The bleeding had slowed, but the fur around it was still damp. He tore a strip from an old towel and wrapped it loosely around her leg, enough to keep it warm. "Easy now," he whispered. "You're safe." He set a shallow bowl of water beside her and dropped a few small pieces of fish nearby. Then he stepped back, watching for a reaction. Maya didn't move, her breathing steady but shallow. The tranquilizer was still working. He knew she'd wake by morning, if she made it through the night. Coleman glanced toward the cabin. Through the window, a faint orange glow flickered from the small stove inside. He thought about dragging in another blanket, but decided against it. She needed space, not confinement. He turned, walked to the shed door, and opened it wide enough to let in the cool air. A soft sound came from outside, the quiet whine of the cubs. They had sensed her return. Coleman stepped into the yard and whistled softly. Two small shapes emerged from under the porch, their eyes catching the light. They froze at the sight of him, but didn't run. He motioned toward the open shed door. "Go on," he said quietly. "She's in there." The cubs hesitated, then padded forward. One stopped halfway, sniffing the air, while the other slipped inside, nose low to the ground. The moment it caught the scent of its mother, it let out a trembling cry. The second cub followed instantly, brushing past Coleman's leg as it ran to her side. Maya didn't move, but the cubs pressed against her, curling up close to her neck. Coleman stepped back, giving them space. He left the door slightly open to let them come and go if they wished, then turned off the lantern and crossed the yard toward the cabin. Inside, he poured himself a cup of coffee from the thermos he'd brought earlier that morning. It had gone cold, but he didn't care. He sank into the chair by the window and stared out toward the shed. The light from the moon cast a pale line across the roof, and somewhere inside, he could hear the faint sound of breathing. 3 of them, maybe 4. He checked his watch. It was almost midnight. Coleman rubbed his palms together, still feeling the rope burns. He should have called the Rangers earlier, but now it was too late in the day. And truthfully, he didn't want to. The lynx would be taken away, maybe sedated again, or worse. He didn't know how she'd react come morning, but he wanted her to wake here, free, near her cubs. Hours passed. The fire in the stove crackled, then dimmed. Coleman dozed off in the chair, the sound of wind outside lulling him half asleep. A sudden thump made him jolt upright. He looked toward the shed, heart pounding. Another noise followed, a soft shuffle, hay moving. He strained to listen. Then silence. He grabbed the lantern, stepped outside barefoot, and crossed the yard. The grass was damp with dew. The shed loomed ahead, darker than before. He hesitated at the door, one hand on the latch. Inside, it was quiet. The cubs were curled up against Maya's side, their small bodies rising and falling. She was awake now, her eyes open, glowing faintly in the lantern's light. Coleman froze. Maya's gaze met his, steady, alert. For a long moment, neither of them moved. He could feel his pulse in his throat. The cubs stirred but didn't flee. Maya's head lifted slightly, her ears twitching. She made no sound, no growl, no threat, just that watchful stare. Then, slowly, she lowered her head again, resting it between her paws. Coleman exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He set the lantern on the floor and backed away one step at a time until he was outside again. The door creaked as he pulled it halfway shut, leaving a small gap for air. He turned toward the lake, the sound of his heartbeat fading into the rhythm of the night. Back inside the cabin, he sat by the window until the first light of dawn brushed the horizon. Through the gray mist, he could still hear the faint, steady breathing from the shed, and he didn't know if it filled him with relief or dread. The first pale light of morning spilled through the mist that hung over the lake. Coleman hadn't slept. He sat by the window, watching the soft haze roll across the water, listening for any sound from the shed. Every few minutes, he thought he heard something. Haze shifting, a soft breath, but then it would fade again. The coffee in his mug had long gone cold. When the first sunbeam cut through the fog and touched the grass, he stood and walked outside. The air was crisp, the kind that bit the lungs. Dew clung to his boots as he crossed the yard. The shed door stood just as he'd left it, slightly ajar. He hesitated for a moment, hand resting on the handle, before pushing it open. Inside, the light was dim but warm. Maya was awake. She lay still for a moment, then lifted her head slowly. Her eyes found him immediately. They weren't the dull, pained eyes of the night before. They were alive, alert. The cubs were pressed close to her, and when she shifted, they stirred too, stretching and blinking in the faint glow. Coleman froze in the doorway. He didn't want to move too fast, didn't want to make her feel cornered. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the soft rustle of hay and the distant call of a loon across the lake. Maya shifted her weight, testing her injured leg. She winced slightly, but managed to stand. Coleman could see the stiffness in her movements, the limp that made every step careful. But she stood tall, her breath steady. The cubs nuzzled her side, mewing softly. She lowered her head and brushed her nose against them. He took a slow step back, letting the door open wider. The cool air drifted in, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Maya's nose twitched. Her gaze moved past him, toward the light beyond the door. "You can go," he said quietly. He wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. She watched him for another second, then moved forward. Each step was deliberate, the limp clear but controlled. When she reached the doorway, she paused, her shoulder brushing the frame. The cubs followed, close to her legs. One of them stopped halfway, glancing back toward the hay as if unsure. Maya gave a low, soft growl, an encouragement, and the cub hurried after her. They stepped out into the sunlight. The golden morning painted their fur in warm tones, and for a heartbeat, the whole scene felt unreal, like something that didn't belong to this world. Coleman stood a few feet away, hands at his sides, watching as Maya turned her head toward him one last time. Her eyes met his again, calm, unreadable. Then she blinked slowly, turned, and led her cubs across the yard toward the tree line. Coleman followed them with his eyes until their shapes vanished into the mist. He exhaled, the tension in his chest easing at last. The shed felt strangely empty now, too quiet. He walked back inside and looked at the pile of hay where they'd lain. A few tufts of fur, a damp towel, nothing more. He smiled faintly. "Good luck out there," he whispered. The day stretched slowly. After cleaning up the shed and washing his hands in the cold water from the lake, Coleman gathered his tools. He walked back into the forest, following the trail the cubs had led him down the day before. When he reached the clearing, the pit was still there, dark, deep, and silent. He stood at the edge for a long moment, staring into the shadows. Then he got to work. He dragged fallen branches and long planks from an old dock he'd disassembled years ago. He layered them over the pit, anchoring them with stones and dirt. It took hours, but by noon the hole was covered, stable enough to hold weight. He marked the trees around it with red paint from his tackle shed, a warning for anyone who might come through. By the time he finished, his shirt was damp with sweat and his hands ached. He stood back, surveying the spot, then nodded once. No one would fall in there again. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, he sat at the end of the small wooden pier, fishing rod by his side. The water reflected the orange sky, calm and still. He hadn't caught a thing all week, and now he didn't care. The quiet was enough. A breeze drifted through the reeds, carrying the faintest echo of something from the forest, a distant sound, like a cub calling. Coleman smiled to himself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. He leaned back on his hands, staring at the last streaks of color fading from the horizon. The trip had been meant for rest, for fishing, for silence. Instead, it had reminded him of something else entirely. That sometimes, even out here, you find a reason to act, to care, to help. And that reason looks back at you with wild eyes before disappearing into the trees. The first stars appeared above the lake, shimmering faintly on the surface. Coleman stayed there until the light was gone, listening to the wind whisper through the pines, the steady heartbeat of the wild all around him.